So, okay, welcome everybody to our second keynote speech. I think that, it's basically impossible to do a reasonable and good introduction of Sheridan. I think that even someone that is doing banking knows that Sheridan was doing things like momentum, and all this type. So just let me tell you that, he's holding the McAllister Centennial Chair in Financial Services at the MCOM's School of Business of the University of Texas at Austin. He's published everywhere, basically. He's published in a lot of topics: asset pricing, corporate finance, real estate, even accounting. And there's one thing that,
But I'm not proud of that.
And, as a European, I must say that, and now that I'm a bit involved with the review of finance, I'm proud to say that he also won, one of his papers was the GSM Best Paper Award of the Review of Finance. He's also won the Smith Brennan Prize of the Journal of Finance, okay? And basically, just let me tell you that on top of doing all of this stuff, he also has time to take some unknown young visiting professors that go to Texas to very interesting walks around the campus and talk about finance and real estate. Okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, David. No, I really do appreciate, having the opportunity to come to Madrid. I always like Madrid, and it's great having the opportunity to talk to you guys about my latest research. Lately, I've been telling my PhD students that one strategy for looking for a dissertation is to learn some subfield of economics relatively well, like IO or labor, and look for issues that are on the interface between that subfield and finance. That's potentially a good way to think about finding a dissertation. So what I'm talking about today is issues on the interface of geography, economic geography, urban economics, and finance. This is an area that I've been particularly interested in for about 15 years now, actually even longer. When I originally started my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, the first summer where we had to pick out a topic for a summer paper, I decided to work on urban economics. So initially that was the field that I got into. I found these models of urban economics a little bit too challenging for me at least, so I switched to corporate finance. But then later, I've sort of switched back and started thinking very, very seriously about urban economics. And given that I have some basis in finance, now I'm looking at sort of taking my advice and looking at the interface between urban economics and finance. Since I originally started this line of thought when I was a student in Carnegie Mellon at Pittsburgh, and I was just in Pittsburgh a couple weeks ago, so Pittsburgh kind of comes to mind when I think about sort of the evolution of how people are thinking about urban economics and how that's changed over the last 20 years or so. If you think about Pittsburgh, that's a great example. Pittsburgh was one of the most prosperous cities in the world at the turn of the last century. Okay, it's a steel town. And Pittsburgh was all about proximity to transportation. Back then, transportation meant being on large bodies of water. And Pittsburgh is the intersection of two rivers. They call it three rivers in Pittsburgh, but it's actually two rivers that form a third river. So it's the intersection of two rivers. They think it's three rivers. We also have proximity to coal and proximity to iron. So if you combine transportation, iron, and coal, you've got sort of the perfect location for the steel industry. And so 150 years ago or 100 years ago, Pittsburgh was a center of the worldwide steel industry, and you had people like Carnegie and Mellon that made a lot of money because they happened to be in Pittsburgh at the right time. Okay. So as the steel industry in Pittsburgh declined, and when I was a student at Carnegie Mellon, that was basically the decline of the steel industry and the fact that Pittsburgh was kind of dying at the time. As steel died, Pittsburgh died as well. But Pittsburgh had something else going for it. And I would think it was, to a large extent, the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon. And Pittsburgh is making a big comeback now. And people don't talk about moving to Pittsburgh because it's, great rivers. To the extent that they have great rivers, it's because being next to a river is an amenity that you kind of like if you're writing a computer program. Not for transportation reasons, but it's kind of a nice thing to look at. And there's nice restaurants on the river and all the amenities that are going to attract that type of person. But the point is that Pittsburgh is now a human capital city, and because of Carnegie Mellon, Pittsburgh has become very large in robotics. And because they're big in robotics, Google wants to be there, Uber wants to be there. It's become a tech center of sorts, and the University of Pittsburgh Medical School has become the regional medical center for that area. And actually, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is the biggest employer in Pittsburgh. Actually, the old U.S. Steel building is now owned by the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, I think. So the point is that urban economics used to always be about proximity to something physical. Okay, now urban economics, to a large extent, is about proximity to people. Okay, that's kind of a problem for those of us that worry about doing empirical research on economics, because in some sense everything's endogenous. Okay, so why do people want to be in Silicon Valley? All the top tech firms are in Silicon Valley, and if I want to be working in those tech firms, I want to be in Silicon Valley. Why are the top tech firms in Silicon Valley? Because that's where all the talent is. Okay, so it's all sort of endogenous in a certain way. So that's going to be a challenge that we're going to have to talk about, at least think about when you do research on this type of thing. So if we're talking about cities as proximity to talent, going back to what I said at the outset, if you want to think about research on the interface of two different topics, actually we're going to have to bring labor into the mix. Okay, so if you want to be an expert on urban economics now, in some sense you've got to understand labor as well. Okay, so if we want to do geography and finance, in some sense you're doing labor and finance as well, which is kind of good because there's a whole group of people doing labor and finance. And so it's sort of an opportunity to sort of hang out with those guys and contribute to the fact that location is very good for thinking about labor. And in fact, I've always said that if I'm looking for a good proxy for, say, the quality of management, okay, and you've got any theories that say quality of management is important for whatever reason, okay, it might be the location of the managers might actually be a good proxy in some sense for quality. So anyone that's sort of thinking about labor and finance, management and finance, all those things, I think location is actually quite important. Okay, so my talk is going to be on stuff that I'm doing recently. So when I first started putting together the talk, I didn't realize how much time we were going to have. So I wanted to focus on just what I'm thinking about now rather than what I was thinking about 15 years ago. And for these keynotes, I tend to be a little bit too loose because generally it's before lunch and you guys don't want to think too hard. And we don't have much time. But we do have more time, and I'll try to be a little bit more precise. I'm going to be a little bit more precise now, and then for those of you that are interested in theory and other things, I'll have you hold your questions until later, but I'll give you a couple things just to be thinking about now, just to be a little bit more precise. Okay, I'm going to be using the term vibrancy a few times, and Andres says, what the heck do I mean by vibrancy? So I'll be a little bit more precise. When I refer to a city as being vibrant in the sense of what I'm doing, I think about vibrancy as being characterized as sort of an active, thick labor market for skilled labor. Okay, not labor in general, okay, but skilled labor. Okay, so if I've got a very active labor market for manufacturing labor, that's not what I'm talking about. If I have a very active labor market for creative talent and engineers and designers, I'll refer to that as a vibrant labor market. Now, the first point that's important is that for whatever reason, skilled workers are going to be attracted to locations where there's a thick labor market for skilled workers. Okay, and firms will be attracted to thick labor markets as well. So you can think about this in the back of your mind as we're going along on why that necessarily is the case, and we can talk about that later. But the point is there's going to be some sort of clustering of skilled labor in equilibrium, and that if you happen to be in that labor market, you may have some source of comparative advantage. Okay, so in terms of the issues that we need to sort out a little bit better, we've got to think in terms of, why some firms are in the wrong labor market in some sense, and why some happen to be in the right labor market. Okay, so there's all sorts of endogeneity issues that need to be sorted out, and you should be concerned about that. And again, I'm not going to do a very good job of answering those questions as I go along here, but those are issues that clearly need to be thought about a little bit more carefully, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A. Okay, so that's sort of the first issue, is sort of the endogeneity of location, and what do we actually mean by good locations and bad locations. So hopefully I've given you some idea on what I mean by a good versus bad location, a vibrant city versus a less vibrant city, and so on. So you understand what I'm doing. You probably don't have in the back of your mind what the equilibrium looks like, and maybe we'll never get that far, but that's going to be a challenge in terms of what needs to be clarified a little bit more precisely as we go along. Okay, so I don't have that as clarified as I would want it to be. Okay, so the second big challenge, I would say, has to do with the fact that if you do indeed have some locations that are better than other locations, there's going to be rents associated with being in those locations. Okay, so Silicon Valley is great. You got all these talented people, and there's externalities associated with being immersed in talent. Okay, so the question is, if there are externalities associated with being immersed in talent, there's going to be rents associated with being immersed in talent. Okay, so the challenge is, how do those rents get divided? Okay, so some of the rents are going to go to the landowners. Okay, I own land in Palo Alto. Everyone wants to be in Palo Alto, so obviously my land is worth something. Okay, the workers having been born in Palo Alto, there's some advantage of being born in Palo Alto, and firms being in Palo Alto, there's going to be some advantage there as well. Okay, so the challenge is thinking about how those rents get divided up by the different stakeholders. Okay, so again, I don't pretend to have that completely figured out, but that's clearly a challenge that we need to think about a little bit more carefully. The urban economists think a lot about labor and land. Okay, so they generally don't have firms in any meaningful way into their models. They talk about wage rates and proximity to employment, and they've got models of cities where people commute to the center of the city to work, and they can calculate what the rents are going to be and the labor costs and all those sorts of things within their models, but they don't think too carefully about firms. Okay, so as financial economists, in some sense, that's our responsibility to think a little bit more carefully about how to think about, you know, the rents that are captured by firms from being in these locations. Okay, so again, I'm going to talk loosely about these things, and I'm going to talk about some empirical evidence. And if we have time at the end, given that there's better theorists here than me, we can talk about that as well. Okay, one thing that I want to emphasize, again, that's one of the advantages of not being completely on top of things, is that I want to emphasize that this is an area that I think is really interesting and important, and it's an area where not everything's figured out exactly the way it should be. So the fact that we're not going to be able to answer all the questions, I think, is an advantage for those of you that are looking for areas to do research. Geography is especially important if you're interested in real estate. Okay, so I teach real estate, so I need to understand, you know, why rents in Manhattan, New York are higher than Manhattan, Kansas. We have all these discussions on, you know, why price to income ratios are so high in China relative to Australia and so on, and people have all sorts of very loose issues, ways of thinking about this. I don't think people are very precise when they're talking about those issues at all. But you can't really answer those questions on what determines rents and prices in different countries and different cities without thinking about the issues of where the firms want to locate. Okay, so you can't think about why Palo Alto is expensive without thinking about why it's a comparative advantage for Google to be in Palo Alto. We can't think about what's going on in Austin without understanding why Google is basically moving some of their workers from Palo Alto to Austin and trying to understand at what stage is it better for them to have workers in Austin versus Palo Alto. So I think that's incredibly important. And the other thing that I just want to emphasize is that to a large extent, the financial crisis was caused by the fact that economists don't think about real estate. Okay, so we don't have good ways of thinking about whether housing prices are high versus low, whether commercial prices are high versus low. We don't have good ways of thinking about how volatile are these prices. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about any of those issues here today, but my point is that the types of issues that I want to talk about are all going to feed into all these issues that are important for real estate. And if you guys are interested in banking, you know, banks live and die by you know, fluctuations in real estate markets. So I think for all economists, these are issues that are of first order importance. Okay, so in terms of asking questions as I go along, that's fine. The way I want to organize this is that if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense and you need clarification, don't be shy about asking me to clarify, okay? Because I tend to be, you know, not necessarily the most coherent person in the world. So don't be shy about asking for clarification. If you want to basically argue about what I'm doing and saying that makes no sense, You can do that at the end. I like that at the end, not necessarily as I'm talking. So we'll do clarification questions as I go along, and then we'll have time for Q&A, where we can talk about the theory in a little bit more precisely and talk about extensions and other things like that. From Itai's talk yesterday, one thing we learned is that if you ask questions, you have to speak really loudly, okay? David here doesn't hear very well, so he says that we've got to remind people that if someone on this side of the room has a question, the people on this side of the room won't hear it if they don't talk loudly. Okay, so that would be in terms of rules. And we've got time here, so if I run too late, you can give me a little signal. Okay, so a couple things that I want to just do from the outset. We've got here saying cities are the new industries. What I mean by that is that I'm going to give you evidence that we've got evidence of co-movement of various things like stock returns, investment levels, capital structures, and so on, that seem to be related to cities, not as strongly as industries, okay, but more strongly than I would have originally thought when I started this research. Okay, so the thing that I want you to take away from this talk, there's only one thing to take away. If you're doing empirical corporate finance or empirical investment research, okay, and you feel compelled to have industry fixed effects in your regressions, okay, you should also feel compelled for the same reason to have location fixed effects. Okay, it's not as important as industry, but it's more important than you may have originally thought. Okay, so that's the first thing that I want to talk about. And I'm going to do that fairly briefly. Okay, I'm going to spend more time on this idea of location and value creation. Okay, so is it important to be in a more vibrant city? Is there a valuation advantage? Do I create value from my location, from where I'm actually operating from? Okay, so how does this work? Okay, if you've been following the news for the last couple of years, you'll see that firms in general have started to think and at least talk about more location as a strategic choice. Okay, so a few years back, GE had been in a suburban location outside of New York and Connecticut, Fairfield, Connecticut, I think, for basically the last 100 years. Okay, so they built this company. At one point, GE had the largest market cap in the world, located in this location, and as Jeff Immelt was saying, people like sitting there. You're in a nice location on a corporate campus. You can look out your windows, you see the deer going by. It's a very pleasant place to be. Okay, he decided, and this was very costly, to move from Connecticut to downtown Boston for his headquarters. And he basically says, and I'm not sure he articulates this in any precise way, but people are going to be more creative for whatever reason, being located in an environment where there's a lot of other creative people. Okay, so GE decided to do this. What probably got even more attention in the media, at least in the United States, was Amazon looking for a second headquarters. And Amazon was pretty precise in the way they were thinking about their second headquarters. And it was very clear it was all about proximity to people. Okay, so Amazon wanted to be somewhere else other than Seattle because they were too big relative to Seattle. They wanted to be somewhere else where they're going to be attracting talent. Okay, so again, in these two examples, you've got sort of two sides of the issue in urban economics and labor. Okay, Jeff Immelt was basically saying his actual workers that he already has, his top management, they would be more creative by being in a more creative environment. Okay, so that's the idea that location actually creates talent in some ways. I think Amazon is thinking about it slightly differently. Amazon is thinking about the fact that location is important for attracting talent. Okay, so talent can be created, talent can be attracted. Okay, they're both probably equally important. I'm not sure in terms of empirically whether you can distinguish between that hypothesis. Is Silicon Valley productive because it attracts the best talent from throughout the world, or is it being within, immersed in that talent, creates talent itself? Okay, so urban economists talk about both of those issues, and I don't think they can empirically distinguish between those two hypotheses. Okay, this I think is one of the most salient facts in finance, and I'm a collector of what I'll call salient facts, things that are very important to know. You know, one fact that I always thought was very important to know was that underwriting spreads in Europe were about half the underwriting spreads in the US. Never understood exactly why that was, but if you're working on investment banking, something you obviously need to understand. What I have up here, and this is about a couple years old in terms of closing prices at the end of, I think it was 2018. So it's not up to date. It could even be 2017. It's market caps of companies that went public after 1980. So they have to be new companies that went public after 1980. It was a little confusing when we first did it because we had Citigroup there. And I said, that can't be right. And it was, well, Citigroup changed from a holding company to something else. So it was listed on CRSP as a new company in the 80s. So we had to make sure that these were companies that were founded and went public after 1980. Okay, so roughly speaking, what would you say if you look at the market cap of all new companies over the last 40 years, and you add up the market cap of all those companies, and then you ask what percentage of that market cap are firms in Seattle and the Bay Area? What would you say that would be? I've sort of given it away because I've got it up here, but most people will think it's really large and say, I bet it's half the market cap. Well, it's more like 80% of the market cap. Okay, so most of the value creation of new companies in the United States are from just 2 metropolitan areas. Okay, and it's not just, I mean, to a large extent, because, you know, the FANG stocks, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, they're in those 2 cities. It's mainly the tech companies, but then you've got companies like Starbucks, which is Seattle. You've got Costco, which is Seattle. You've got biotech, which is in the Bay Area. So it's not just those companies, it's other companies as well. But the point is, it's not just, you know, the majority of the value creation, it's, you know, in some sense the supermajority of the value creation of new public companies are in just 2 locations. So I think that's a fact that we need to take very, very seriously when we think about value creation in general. So just something to think about as we're going along. Okay, I've got a paper, and I'm not going to really talk much about this paper because most of what's in that is sort of tangential to the main ideas that we want to talk about. But there's a table in the paper that I just want to use to talk about to sort of frame the issue. So the table here is basically running regressions. Like the first column is running a regression of change in earnings per share for my individual firm on contemporaneous change in earnings of other firms in my city, but not in my industry. Okay? And the second one variable is change in earnings of firms in my industry, but not in my city. Okay, so what we're interested in is the extent to which the change in earnings for other firms in my city that aren't in my industry, how correlated is that to my change in earnings? Okay, so you can see that it's not nearly as strong. Well, it's about 1/4 as strong as the industry effect, but it's still quite significant. And you can see this when you look at change in sales, changes in employees, capital investment. They're all strongly related to what's going on with other firms in the same city that are not in the same industry. Okay, so there's a big city effect here. Yeah?
Clarify, city's headquarters.
The headquarters city. Yeah, and that's very important. Okay, so a lot of these big firms, you know, they're located all over. Okay, so Amazon's located all over. Amazon's big in Austin, big in New York. Yeah, I don't care where Starbucks has their stores. Okay, so the idea is we're interested in where, again, what I'll call the talent lives. Okay, so the guys at Starbucks that are designing their stores, that are deciding what kind of coffee to have, that are designing their information systems, those guys are all sitting in Seattle. Okay, in other talks, you know, I've made a lot of comparisons between Kmart, which was a failed retailer that was headquartered in Detroit, and Target, which was headquartered in Minneapolis. Their businesses were almost identical. Okay, their location of their stores were basically the same. Okay, the difference was one was headquartered in Minneapolis, which has been a very successful city, and the other was located in Detroit, which was a failing city. Okay, so Kmart failed as Detroit was failing, while Minneapolis did well and Target did well. Okay, so it's the headquarters that matters, not the physical location of where they do business. So that's an important clarifying question. Thank you. Okay, now the paper that I was just talking about, to a large extent, it's about returns. Okay, so stock returns are moving with the stock returns of other firms in the same city. Okay, so there's a big city effect. This isn't important for what I want to talk about here, but the city effect is stronger when you go from monthly returns to yearly returns. Okay, now the reason why that was important was there was a literature that was suggesting that because of home bias, that stocks in the same city would move together too much because of discount rate effects. Okay, now my view is if that were the case, then the monthly effect should be stronger than the yearly effect. Okay, but the yearly effect is stronger than the monthly effect. So the view is that there's underreaction to the city effect rather than overreaction to the city effect. And as a result, we have some trading strategy that exploits that underreaction. Okay. So this is just saying you'd make money with our trading strategy. Okay. This is the only published paper that I want to talk about. And I don't want to talk about this too much because I want to emphasize the next paper, which builds on this. But this is a recent JF paper, came out last fall, and we're looking at financial misconduct. Okay, so I like to think of sort of two sides of as you call it, vibrancy of the quality of the labor force in a city. Okay, I'm going to emphasize mainly sort of what I'll call the talent side. Okay, is this city attracting the best engineers, the best talent? Okay, there's also what I'll call a bad cultural side, where sort of levels of trust are lower or levels of misconduct are higher. And I think that'll be clear as we go along. Okay, so what we're trying to identify in this paper is, do we have exogenous measures of misconduct outside of finance that feeds into basically misconduct at the headquarter level of firms in terms of their financial misconduct. So if you're in a sleazy city, are you more likely to do, financial manipulation of various sorts? Okay, so that's the idea there, which I didn't find particularly interesting on its face of it, but I think it's important when we think about some issues in corporate finance, which is where I was heading for when we started this research. But in any event, the idea is that cities differ in terms of what we'll call the culture of corruption. Okay, so we can say cities have different cultures. Sociologists talk about different reasons why cultures may differ from city to city, country to country, which I'm not going to get into at all. But I'll give you sort of 4 different measures. Okay, the first, and this was a paper, this comes from some research that Chris Parsons did, my co-author on this paper. Just to be clear, Chris Parsons and Johan Suleiman. Johan's at in Singapore, National University of Singapore, and Chris is currently at University of Washington. He was at least 4 different schools while we were writing this paper, so I have trouble keeping track. So he has a paper where he looks at doctors and the extent to which doctors are going to be what I would call influenced by marketing. Okay, so pharmaceutical firms spend huge amounts of money marketing to doctors. And they take them to dinner, they take them to football games, they do more, they pay them to give talks at conferences. So they're doing a lot of things, and they're required to disclose everything they do. Okay, so if you take any federal money, which like Medicare, you've got to disclose everything. And so we've got very good data on every time a doctor is taken to dinner by a pharmaceutical rep. So the question that Chris and his co-authors look at in their paper is, to what extent are doctors more likely to prescribe medicine because they've been taken to dinner by a pharmaceutical rep? Okay, so that differs across cities, across doctors, for a variety of reasons. Okay, so male doctors are more influenced by marketing than female doctors. Okay, Eli Lilly hires former cheerleaders as their reps, so that may have something to do with that. Different cities are more influenced than other cities. Okay, so in some cities, the doctors are not particularly influenced by the farm reps. Other cities are very influenced. Okay, so the measure that we're using is, do you happen to be in a city where the doctors are more influenced by being taken to dinner by a pharmaceutical rep? Okay, that's our first measure. Okay, the second measure, really, I don't think it really belongs there. I think the reason why it's where it is rather than as a dependent variable is sort of the time series of how this paper got reviewed. But in any event, the second measure is also a measure of financial manipulation, but it's a measure of whether or not firms were backdating the options of their executives. So this is a big scandal about 5 to 10 years ago. Stephen Jobs was probably the most famous participant here. Was they backdated his options. Generally, options are issued at the money. So you had Jobs as, they decided when to give Jobs a lot of options. The stock price was 120. They said, gee, we can give him even more money if we say we made this deal 3 weeks earlier when the stock price was only 100. Okay, so this is a big scandal. It also has a location basis. Okay. The third thing is political corruption. Okay, so there's a lot of literature in the economics literature that's basically measuring various types of political corruption, politicians being indicted for various types of fraud. Okay, so we have a cross-section on, for each city, how often that happens. Okay, and the fourth thing, this is something that Chris came up with. There's a website called Ashley Madison, and Ashley Madison is a website, a dating app, I guess, for married people. And somehow they got hacked, and the data became available. And so we know the usage of Ashley Madison across cities. Okay, so in some cities it's used a lot, in other cities it wasn't used very much. Yeah?
That's okay. So I'm very curious, I cannot wait longer for you to explain this. So are there any observable city characteristics that explain these differences in culture? I would think that social norms, for instance, are stronger in cities with smaller population. It's easier to monitor your neighbors and their behavior. Do you look at that at all?
We don't look at that directly, but we put in all those things as control variables. Okay, so we basically run these regressions. We've got our culture variables in there, and then we control for these economic variables. Okay, that's probably a literature that's doing exactly what you're talking about. Okay. So what we've got is our sleaze index, where we combine these 4 different measures. And so this very roughly says, okay, we've got Miami is the sleaziest city in the United States. I presented this paper in Miami, and they all confirmed that this was the case. And during my talk, someone got a message on his phone that someone had stolen his credit card number and was charging things to it. And he says, yeah, that happens all the time in Miami. So Miami is kind of famous for that. Actually, the Texas cities, Dallas and Houston, are also high up on that. And so what we're basically doing is we're regressing our the rate of financial manipulation in a city on what do we call our sleaze index, and we find a pretty strong relationship there. Okay. Now, this actually was a paper, but when I originally envisioned this was just going to be the first part of the paper, and I was more interested in the second part of the paper, which was how does this affect how firms actually operate. Okay. So in this paper, the same set of co-authors, we're looking at firms that may be financially distressed and whether or not financial distress is going to affect firms differently depending on where they're located. Okay, so the intuition here was that generally, before I go bankrupt, I'm going to hit an event, and this event is going to be such where it's not going to be clear whether or not I have been hit by a temporary liquidity shock versus a permanent shock. Okay, so in general, I want to convince my banker that this is just a temporary liquidity shock. Okay, so I've got a lot of loans, I've got debt covenants that I violated. I go to the bank, I say to my banker, yeah, I violated a covenant here. This is no big deal. This is just a short-term thing. I've got these issues here. Everything's under control. Why don't we just extend this for another 3 months? Everything's going to turn out okay. Okay. So if I've got a good relationship with my banker, and my banker trusts me, the banker is going to basically say, yeah, let's let this thing fly for another 3 months, because it's very costly for the bank to foreclose on that loan. Okay, so they'd rather, basically what they say, extend, pretend, whatever you want to call it, and basically hope for the best. Okay, so the original hypothesis was that if I'm in a city where people trust each other, I'm more likely to have my loan extended. If I'm in a sleazier city where there's more financial manipulation, okay, the banker's less likely to do that and more likely to say, no, we're going to pull in your loan and force the firm into bankruptcy. Okay, so the idea here was that culture of a city and the degree of financial manipulation was going to affect the bankruptcy rates in those cities. Okay, so that's the idea. This is still work in progress. These things take a while. Okay, so what we've done in this regression is just wanting to look to see whether or not there's a city effect. Okay, so what we've done is that we've taken the variables that you see in the bankruptcy literature. There's a big literature where you basically have a logit or probit type regression where the left-hand side is whether or not the firm's gone bankrupt in this year, and on the right-hand side is all sorts of variables like the leverage ratio, you know, the past stock returns, all, you know, anything that you would think of that could affect bankruptcy is basically put on the right-hand side. Okay, so we're basically taking models that other people have used and adding dummy variables for the bankruptcy rate in the city. Okay, so we've got a couple dummies, and we're basically looking at whether or not you're in a city where the other firms are going bankrupt, whether or not that makes it more likely that you're going to go bankrupt. And you see those city dummies are actually quite significant. Okay, so controlling for your balance sheet, an income statement, location matters. We've also done it by adding in the firm's credit rating. Okay, so presumably Moody's and S&P, they've looked carefully, and their credit ratings are supposed to be a measure of the probability of bankruptcy. So it should be that when you add their credit rating, you should be able to do a very good job on top of that in explaining bankruptcy. And indeed, we still explain bankruptcy. I asked guys at Moody's about this. I talked to their head of research and said, you know, what's going on here? You guys could do a whole lot better adding location to your models. And they said, no, we don't add location to our models. I don't find your results surprising. And he said, we do even, you know, one step worse than that, is that we make sure that location isn't implicitly incorporated into our model. Okay, so we don't want to be accused of basically causing Detroit to go under because we're downgrading all the Detroit firms. Okay, so we don't just unconsciously ignore location, we consciously ignore location. So if you add location to their models, you do better. Okay, what we haven't done is to see whether if you're actually trading bonds or credit default swaps, whether incorporating location would be helpful for you. Did you have a question?
Yes, you assume that you control for many
You have to talk very loudly, by the way.
I assume that you control for many things, but political correctness is always a problem in academics.
Okay.
You control for ethnicity, skin color.
Well, these are cities. These are firms.
Yeah, but probably there's correlation with those individual characteristics and people in those particular cities.
No, no. Okay, so in this regression, we don't have any characteristics of the city other than the bankruptcy rates in the city. Okay, so we don't control for the ethnicity of the city. We're only worried about the bankruptcy. So what you're saying is that,
The most corrupted city is the city that has more.
okay, so we do that. Right, right. No, we do control for demographics in our other paper. So we're finding that if you take the rate of financial manipulation and regress that on other cultural characteristics and controlling for economic characteristics, that still holds. Okay. Okay. So, so this is just with dummy variables, but if you look at corporate fraud rates and failure rates, you see there's a direct relationship there. Now, when you add the corporate fraud rates, that's not going to basically explain away the city fixed effects. Okay, so there's a lot going on that's basically in the relationship between city fixed effects and bankruptcy rates can't be explained completely by corporate fraud. Okay, but corporate fraud does in fact explain bankruptcy. And again, the correlation is pretty high. Okay, so again, just to tell our story, I think the story is loosely consistent with the fact that struggling firms in more corrupt cities are going to have more difficulty obtaining credit. And because of that, when they're doing badly, they're more likely to go under. Okay, so I think that's the result there. How am I doing on time? I'm doing good. Okay, so this is the latest paper that we're working on. All these papers are with Chris Parsons, and I've got a variety of other co-authors. So Casey Dougal, he's actually just moved from Drexel to Florida State. So all my co-authors sort of move around as we do these things. But anyway, the question that we're asking here is something that was motivated by this salient fact that I had at the outset, which is how important is headquarter location to value creation. And what we want to ask about is, has it become more important or less important over time? Okay, so originally there was a book by Thomas Friedman. I don't know if you guys read the book. It got a lot of attention about 15 years ago, called The World is Flat. And the idea was, because of the internet, location has become less important. Okay, so the idea was that we could all live in Aspen and telecommute. That, you know, I didn't have to live in Manhattan if I didn't want to live in Manhattan. The alternative story was that value is being created by ideas now more than ever, and idea creation requires face-to-face contact, and just sending emails to my co-authors is not good enough. I have to be in the same room and on the blackboard to really come up with the idea. I can edit the paper long distance, but coming up with the idea, it's good to be in the same room. Okay, so those are sort of the alternative stories for has the internet made location more or less important, and that's one of the main things that we want to study in this paper. The second thing is, can we be a little bit more precise about what urban attributes facilitate value creation? Okay, so what are the exogenous attributes of cities that are going to be associated with what I call vibrancy? Okay, and we're going to do a little bit, if we have time, talking about sort of the decomposition of the value creation? Is it because these firms have become more profitable? Is it because their discount rates are lower? Or is it because they're creating new products that are going to generate profits in the future? Okay, so is it growth opportunities or more valuable assets in place or lower discount rates? Okay, so we're running regressions that look basically like this, where we've got Tobin's Q on the left-hand side. We've got industry fixed effects, city fixed effects, year fixed effects, and we're running this regression in the first half of the sample and in the second half of the sample. The division of first and second half corresponds to 1994, 1995, which is the birth of the internet. Okay, so before and after the internet is a way to think about this. So what we're doing is running this regression in the two time periods. The way I think about it is that the coefficient on the city dummy should be thought about as the industry adjusted Tobin's Q of the city. Okay? So you can see here, pre-1995, you still see San Jose and San Francisco have the highest industry adjusted Qs. And you got what's on the bottom here, Houston, New York, Chicago. Okay, those are low. Okay, so this is pre-1995. Okay, you go to post-1995, the ordering hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's spread out a lot. Okay, so this is kind of a quick and dirty way of saying it looks like location has been more important for value creation in the recent period than in the past period. Okay, so in terms of city fixed effects, it's important just to know that where you are affects your market to book ratio, and it's more important over time. Okay. So the question is, can we come up with exogenous urban attributes that are associated with value creation? Okay, I guess you can see this. So what we're doing here, and there's a lot of control variables in there as well, but we're looking at industry adjusted Tobin's Q. We're looking at the difference between industry adjusted Tobin's Q in the early period and the later period, and we're regressing that on various variables that we think are exogenous. Okay, so what we've got here is the percentage of college grads in the city in 1970. Okay, so we're taking this as an exogenous variable. We're talking about education levels 25 years earlier. And the hypothesis is if you're a more educated city 25 years ago, and we get a shock that makes it more attractive to live in more educated cities, okay, those cities are going to attract more educated people. And if part of the benefit of that is captured by the firms, then the market to book ratios in those firms will go up. Okay, so the evidence seems to support that hypothesis. Okay, there's papers that have talked about the inclination of people to move to better climates. Okay, this has happened for a long time, but we also believe that weather is a superior good in the sense that I'm more likely to be willing to pay $1 million extra for my house on the beach if I'm rich rather than if I'm poor. And so maybe if there's talent that's going to be paid well, those guys are going to outbid the less talented for the better weather. So that's kind of our hypothesis, is that talent is going to migrate to better weather. Okay. So we've got a regression here where it's the same dependent variable, the change in Tobin's Q, on what we hope is an exogenous variable, which is the log of pleasant days. Okay, so a pleasant day is a day where it's not super hot and it's not super cold, and it's not raining. And if you're in a city like Los Angeles, you got lots of pleasant days. That's going to be attractive. If you're in Pittsburgh, it's not so pleasant. Pittsburgh's going to rate low on this. Okay, so again, you see that correlation there. Okay, I'm not going to go into this. This is kind of trivial, but you can decompose the market to book ratio into, return on assets and the discount rate and the growth rate of earnings. Does the evidence seem to suggest that what we're seeing is because of ROA going up in those cities, or is it because of discount rates going down or growth rates going up? We can measure the ROA directly. The others we can't really measure. We don't really observe growth rates, and we don't really observe discount rates. So we're going to have to be a little bit creative when thinking about discount rates and growth rates. Okay. In this regression, we're looking at Tobin's Q on, and I'm not sure what's on this graph actually. Fix of X. Oh, it's investment. Okay, so we're asking whether or not in the cities that have higher Tobin's Q, whether those are the cities where firms invest the most. Okay, so we look at CapEx over total assets for the firms in the different cities, and we find that, in the cities that have the high Tobin's Q, those are the cities where CapEx is higher. Okay, it's the same thing with R&D. These are the cities where R&D is higher. In some sense, there's some mechanical relationships here. So I worry a little bit about endogeneity issues on these particular regressions. And here is equity issuances. Okay, so the cities that have high Tobin's Q are the cities that you see a lot of equity issuance. Okay, so there's severe endogeneity if you're looking at individual firms here. Okay, so if I look at an individual firm, of course, firms that have high market to book ratios issue more equity. Okay, so what we're saying here is if we're in a city where other firms have high market to book ratios, am I more likely to issue equity? And the answer is yes. Okay. Profitability, we get nothing here. Okay, if anything, it goes the wrong way. Okay, so in these more vibrant cities, okay, the firms are not more profitable. Okay, so if you're an urban economist, and the urban economists are more likely to look at individual establishment levels rather than headquarters levels, and they look at the profitability of establishments in different cities, okay, they're not going to pick up anything here. Okay, so we would argue that in terms of actual current profits, sort of the return on assets in place, these are not the best places to be. Okay, so I can't run my production line any faster in California than I can in Detroit, and my workers have to live there and pay very high housing costs, so I have to pay the workers more. It's likely not to be the best place for doing manufacturing or whatever. So assets in place are not more profitable in these cities. Yeah.
Profitability here is average. You haven't looked at the distribution by quantities.
Well, we can look at it by firm. Okay, so we can look at the return on assets for a firm and regress it on a bunch of things and location. So that's possible to do.
But that's not the,
Well, we've done things similar to that, but the point is you don't find anything when you do that.
you don't have maybe the average. I mean, there's a growth effect, a growth firm effect. But the average
Well, the point is,
return is going to be lower, but the highest returns are also going to be
You're saying there's going to be outliers there. That's possible. We haven't looked at it that way. I mean, again, what we're looking at is average return on assets and growth opportunities. So we're saying on average, the return on assets isn't particularly high in these cities, but the growth opportunities seem to be good. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is easy to read. Actually, this is a little bit easier, but basically what we're showing here is that in these cities with high Tobin's Q, where the Tobin's Q has increased, housing prices in those cities have increased as well. Okay, so if the firms are creating value, okay, we're paying our workers more and the housing prices are higher as well. And so if you're not creating new products in those cities, it's more expensive to operate in those cities, so you're not making more money. Okay. So I'm going to end with some stock return things. So the stock returns are important because, first off, we want to know whether or not expected rates of return are different in the different cities. Okay, we want to know to what extent there's a discount rate channel. We want to know whether or not there's a bubble channel. Okay, so one story is that stock prices go up a lot in California and Silicon Valley in the 1990s, but then they crash again. So it's part of what we're seeing is some sort of bubble. People get overly excited. Stock prices go up. Firms invest a lot because they've got a lot of money, because they can raise a lot of money by issuing stock. But it was just a temporary phenomenon, and it goes back down. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're running Feynman-Macbeth regressions, and we've done it in a variety of ways. And I won't go into too much details. The first column is sort of the easiest to look at. And we've done this over the whole sample period, but I don't show this regression for the subsamples, which probably should. But what we basically show is that we're actually using the lagged Tobin Q of the city, the industry adjusted Tobin's Q, as an explanatory variable, and using that to predict stock returns of firms in the city the following year. Okay, so as most of you know, that if you run this regression firm by firm, the firm's Q on their stock return, it's negative. The growth firms do badly, the value firms do well. Okay, if you do it on a city by city basis, it goes the other way. Okay, so growth cities have high returns over the sample period, which is what, close to 50 years. They beat value cities. Okay, so being in a glamour city is good relative to being in a value city, we'll say. We've divided this up in various ways, but the concern was, and we wanted to look at the 1990s, and that's where the effect is very strong. So this is the glamour city effect in the 1990s. It's a very strong effect. Okay. And if it was a bubble in some sense, it'd be reversed in the following decade. But no, we don't find that. It continues to be positive in the following decade. Okay, so this isn't an overreaction to a tech bubble. There's something there. And again, I'm not going to call this a risk premium. I would feel more comfortable of basically saying that there was an advantage in being in those cities, and because of that advantage, if you happened to be in that city, you would have realized a higher return. Okay, so I think it's a realized return, not an expected return. But anyway, this is a more careful way of looking at what I'll call the event study. Yeah.
The characteristic of being glamorous.
Talk a little louder.
The previous slide, you have these glamorous cities and value cities. Is this a characteristic that is constant across the sample, or a city can become glamorous in your?
Okay, in this this way, we got a little bit more power, and it changes over time. These are determined by the education levels of the city and the weather. Okay, since it's education and weather, it doesn't change over time. And this is a little bit more clear here. So what we've done here is we've a little bit more careful in the following sense. We've defined cities by their weather and education, and then we looked only at firms that were in those cities in 1990. Okay, so it's a restricted sample. Okay, so we're not looking at IPOs and migration to cities. We're looking at cities that happen to be in the Bay Area in 1990, and we see how they've done. Okay, so it's an event study, which I think is relatively clean. And the idea is that we've got this internet shock that have made these cities more attractive. The fact that the firms happen to be in those cities was at an advantage to them. Okay, and so what this shows is that it was actually a big advantage. And if you go from 1990 to 1995, you see basically nothing. These cities are, the returns for the different cities are basically almost exactly the same, but after 1995 to 1999, you see a huge run-up in firms that happen to be in those cities. Okay, so I think this is the strongest and cleanest evidence that we have. Okay, the other evidence, there's all sorts of things to quibble about in terms of endogeneity, but I think this one is pretty clear. So let me just conclude here, and I think I've said all this, and I've got actually 15 minutes or so for Q&A if you guys have any questions. Yes, sir.
So you can think of the city's Tobin skew as a firm-specific characteristic in a sense. And my question to you is, if you run a Feynman-Macbeth regression with that firm-specific characteristic that is derived from your research, and all of the other characteristics...
What is the firm-specific characteristic?
Say the city's Tobin skew, that could be for each firm, you could say that its city's
right.
skew could be a firm-specific characteristic.
Yeah.
And then if you run a Feynman-Macbeth regression with that characteristic and the other 100 characteristics that we have...
well, I haven't done it with the 100 characteristics, but we certainly run the regression where you've got my own market to book and the city's market to book. And so my own market to book, that's going to be negative, and the city's market to book is going to be positive in the Feynman-Macbeth regression. I mean, we've probably put in a few characteristics, but definitely not 100.
But the question is it explained by the other characteristics, or is it independent?
It's not explained by the few characteristics we've looked at, but it's, again, there's so many characteristics that you could add to the right-hand side. I'm sure you can find a combination that might explain it. But the basic ones don't. So if you take sort of what's on French's website and add that, it doesn't toss it out as far as I know. I may not have looked at all the different combinations. Yeah?
So given your evidence,
Talk louder.
why don't we see universities changing headquarters?
You're asking why firms are not changing headquarters?
Why universities?
Universities aren't changing headquarters?
Why not?
Because it's incredibly expensive. So Cornell, and I think this is saving Cornell. Cornell has a terrible location. They're in Ithaca. I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to Ithaca. So Cornell was basically dying in Ithaca. And Bloomberg came up with this idea of luring firms to what's called Roosevelt Island, which is in between Queens and Manhattan. It's a little island. And Cornell has raised about $2 billion to build what they call Cornell Tech, which is located on Roosevelt Island. Great location. And I think this is going to save Cornell. Because, so they're basically, Cornell's business school is going to have a big location there, and they've got a tech group there, and yeah. So if you have $2 billion, you would do that.
Well, cities may help, right? Not try.
Oh, no, I think for universities it's very important. I mean, one of the reasons I came to UT was it's in Austin, and I thought Austin was a city that could take off, and that, you know, if you look at Austin versus Ann Arbor, you'd think, you know, at the time, University of Michigan was dominating Texas. I think, well, Austin's going to dominate Ann Arbor, so eventually University of Texas is going to be University of Michigan. And now the problem is these things take a long, long time. But I don't think University of Michigan can move to Austin. Yeah.
So you say it's expensive. That was your answer about universities. The same thing is also for firms.
Right. So it's very expensive for firms to move.
At the end if you think about, say, GE now moving the
Right.
to Boston,
Mhm.
the fixed cost is huge.
Right.
Do you have a sense of whether at the end of the day it's a good?
Well, the problem is that people would like to do sort of event studies and say, you know, when firms move, is that good or bad for the firm? Well, the problem is that firms moving is endogenous. And, you know, in some sense, it's like a Hail Mary pass for GE. They're basically this firm that's failing, and Emmelt's about to get fired, and he has to do something. So the fact that they move might be a great idea, but it signals that they're desperate. So I think that's going to be something that's really difficult to test. But when firms move, they do in fact tend to move from locations or to locations that you'd think was good. Now, what's more telling is IPOs. And again, the IPOs occur to a very large extent to, you know, in Seattle and the Bay Area. Okay, so you don't see a lot of firms going public in Philadelphia. So when firms start, you know, they decide to start in these areas. So Facebook, you know, Boston's not a bad location. All the guys starting Facebook were sitting there in Boston, and they decided, well, if we want to be serious, we need to move to Silicon Valley. So at the early stage, yes.
But here
Yeah.
there's a big opportunity. All the big VC capital is in, big chunk is in Silicon Valley.
Well, again, I want to stress that everything's endogenous here. You know, the smart people are in Silicon Valley because that's where the smart people are.
And the money's there because
And the money is there because of that, and they're all there.
that's where the startups, most of the startups.
Right, right. So there's a challenge there because of all the endogeneity, which makes it interesting. Yes, sir. And you have to talk loud.
First of all, I haven't gone to school in University of Michigan. I want to say that Ann Arbor is actually a great place.
Some people just don't know any better, but that's fine.
My comment is sort of related to the sleaze and corruption index that you developed.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's a separate channel for low productivity. So you started off in the presentation talking about GE.
Right.
As you know, GE's stock market valuation, stock price is a fifth, a seventh of its peak.
Right.
I'm wondering, is there a channel for agglomeration to actually negatively accentuate low productivity in an area? Where if you're, say, a local city, is it equivalent to attract a company like Amazon versus attracting a company on the downswing of its life cycle like GE?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, things work both ways. You know, I get a good firm moving into my city. That could be good because of agglomeration benefits and attracting more talent and so on. But if Amazon moves into my backyard, they might actually steal all my talent. So there's some evidence that actually in the best locations you have more bankruptcies as well. Okay, so if you're a struggling firm in Seattle, all your workers can basically jump ship and find a job. So it might be worse being struggling in Seattle than being a struggling firm in Detroit. Okay, so these things go both ways.
So as a city, it's more the density of educated workers rather than the implied productivity of the firms that are co-located there.
Well, the productivity of the firms, that's the endogenous variable that we have to think about. So to some extent, we want to explain the productivity of firms. That's what we want to explain. I'm willing to take the talent of the individuals as exogenous in some sense, or it's not exogenous, but maybe they're endowed with talent, but where they migrate to is going to be endogenous. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any information how you...
Louder.
Do you have some information how your results depend on how much revenues come from outside the state where that city is located? Because for a university it would be very hard to move because you would basically lose most of your...
Right. I mean, what I'm most interested in is city of firms where the creative talent is in the city, but they're exporting to all over the world. Okay, so we don't want to think in terms of the city is located, the firm is located there because that's where the market is. Okay, it's because of where the people are. So again, you know, for Kmart, for example, which is in Detroit, it wouldn't have been super expensive for them to migrate their headquarters because 95% of their capital is located outside of Detroit. And firms do that without moving too much. Exxon was on the East Coast, they moved to Dallas. Exxon has very few people in Dallas, other than their headquarters, because most of their engineering talent is actually in Houston rather than Dallas. Okay, so, I don't know, yeah.
I was just wondering whether you thought about urban planning.
Uh-huh.
There is something, and it's actually exogenous, but it's something that architects have been thinking for decades.
In terms of how the internal city is designed?
How people mingle, how people interact with other people, how you actually set up green versus
Yeah.
green areas. So this is something that has been said. Think about Moses in the case of New York.
Right.
Or not, yeah.
Right. Right. So urban planners think about those things a lot. Yeah, and I haven't thought about that too much in terms of the actual structure of the city, in terms of the optimal structure. I mean, I've thought about how the structure of the city affects the volatility of the real estate. Okay, so if everything's located in one central business district, that's going to affect volatility differently than if the city has a lot of subcenters. Okay, but in terms of value creation and other things, I'm not sure exactly how to attack that problem. Yeah.
I was wondering whether also how can you incorporate the reaction of the community, because you know the Amazon.
A little louder.
The Amazon movement to New York failed because the community reacted in a very bad way, and there was a lot of demagogia there.
Right.
And finally, the cost benefit there was a high cost in terms of image that favored the in terms of location made all sense, but the reaction of the community was so bad that it failed. In that sense, very important.
Right. I mean, the question, and it goes back to the issue of who's enjoying the rents associated with the agglomeration externalities. Okay, so there's lots of reasons why New York as a whole, in some sense, could benefit from having Amazon move to Queens, which I think is your question. But then it's a question of who's going to capture those rents. Are they all being captured by Amazon? Are they being captured by individuals in New York that are already there that can work for Amazon? You know, or is it going to basically say, okay, it's just raising rents in that area, and if I'm not going to work for Amazon and I'm renting an apartment in that area, my rent goes up and I don't benefit at all. Okay, so sort of any time you think about agglomeration externalities, you're thinking about rents that are being divided, and that's a complicated question. Yeah. And again, talk loudly. People can't hear on the other side.
Yeah, I was thinking about what is happening currently in terms of cities usually competing to become headquarters.
Right.
And some of the deals with sweeteners that are usually added are tax breaks. So what do you think is the role of tax breaks in value creation for the firms?
Okay, the question was, to attract these firms, we're going to give them tax breaks, and who's going to benefit? It's a similar question as what was controversial about Amazon moving to Long Island City and Queens. And again, my answer is for the cities, to me, I mean, it's a difficult question in the sense that it's not clear why I want to attract one Amazon, which is big, rather than 100 little firms, and why one should be subsidized and one should not. The only thing that's worth noting on the Amazon case, again, was that New York requires lots and lots of infrastructure to run. And because it has a lot of infrastructure, the city needs to have a very large tax base. Okay, and you want a progressive tax, so a very small percentage of the city is basically paying for the infrastructure that the whole city enjoys. And if Amazon is going to bring in a lot of workers that are going to contribute to that tax base, they're going to benefit the whole city, and they're going to want to negotiate to capture some of that benefit. And that's why it's controversial.
And from the firm's perspective, do you think it's a source of value creation, these tax breaks?
It's what? I didn't.
From the firm's, for example, from Amazon's perspective, would these tax breaks be a source of value creation for them?
Well, it just is lowering their cost of, I mean, the value creation for Amazon is they want to be in New York because there's a lot of talented people that want to be in New York. And I mean, the way they're thinking about it is they wanted an East Coast as well as a West Coast presence, because there's a lot of people that they want to recruit that just don't want to live on the West Coast. So they wanted to basically have a presence on the East Coast, and that's why they wanted New York and Washington, D.C. So that's their value proposition. And then once they've decided that, then obviously they're in a position to want to negotiate the best deal that they possibly can negotiate. Okay, so from the city's point of view, they understand there's going to be externalities associated with having a firm like this, because there's a benefit from having a thicker labor market for skilled workers. Okay, because if you have a thicker labor market, there's going to be less of a holdup problem for workers that have extreme talent, and so they're going to be more attracted to cities like that. Okay, so those are the spillover benefits for why they're willing to, pay. The question is, are they paying too much or too little? I don't know. Anything else? I think we're running out of time here. Okay, thank you very much.
One last thing, before we go for lunch, please, today we're going to have the gala dinner at the Spanish Stock Exchange. It's at 9. I'm sorry, we're in Spain. That's super early for Spain. But it would be good if you could bring some personal ID. Okay, if you have it on you. If not, we'll try to figure out. But if you have some personal ID, it would help. For the Spaniards, it's easy, okay? You try your ID. For the non-Spaniards, well, if you have something that could prove that it's you who you are, then maybe it helps the process a little bit. If not, the line is going to be longer. It's going to take a bit more time. Okay, thank you.